Hello everyone and welcome to the Sky this month for March 2025. My name's Paul Martinaitis and this show is brought to you by the Astronomical Society of South Australia. So I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and New Year's period and got to do some observing over the summer. Of course, it was a wonderful time with most of the planets conveniently placed for observation, as well, of course, we also had Comet Atlas, which put on a wonderful display during January. So we had a little break over the summer, but now we're back for the rest of the year with the Sky this month. So as usual, we'll start off with a tour of the night sky. We'll then take a look at the solar system and some remaining opportunities to view some of the planets before they fade into the evening twilight. And then we'll take a look at some objects in our constellation of the month, which will be Carina. So we're looking at the sky as it'll appear towards the end of March on the 22nd, which will be at the start of the dark sky period at around 9 p.m. in the evening. So sort of a bit lower down towards the horizon, we can see that Eridanus, the second longest constellation, is dominating that part of the sky, still reasonably well placed. So a good chance to catch some of the galaxies, some of the many fine galaxies in Eridanus, as well as two excellent planetary nebulae. We have NGC 1360 here, which is a sort of a lovely, very quite large apparent diameter diffuse sort of planetary nebula. Has a bluish tinge to it. Unlike many, most planetary nebula, I find it's probably best viewed without a filter, whereas most, of course, do respond very strongly, particularly to an O3 filter. And then we also have NGC 1535 as well. So that's quite a bit smaller in diameter, much more intense. And this does respond both to high magnification and, of course, an oxygen-free filter. And on a really good night, you can see not only that outer shell, but you can see that inner shell as well around the central star. Looking a bit further up, of course, we have Orion. The great summer constellation, still really well placed at the moment. And further up still, we have Canis Major right up near the zenith. And in the December show, I went through a couple of several of the objects from Canis Major. So if you missed that part of it, I invite you to go back to the December show and perhaps just take a look at the constellation of the month section. Looking towards the north now, we have Taurus, sort of close to the horizon. That's at the moment being visited by Jupiter. To the right here, we have Gemini, which contains Mars. And you can see over here, there's the Pleiades and there's Uranus. So Uranus is kind of between Pleiades and Cetus towards the left. So the northerly view early in the evening presents our last chance to see three of the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Uranus. Looking a little bit further up, we have Monoceros, a rather faint constellation, but contains many wonderful objects, which I think we talked about in detail last in the December 2023 shows. So some of the key objects you want to take a look at while it's placed so high in the sky are the Rosette Nebula, and there's also Hubble's Variable Nebula and the Christmas Tree Cluster. So amongst others, they're three of the best objects, but there's many other great objects as well in Monoceros. And then looking over to the right there, of course, we can see Leo is now starting to make an appearance. So if you're still up later in the evening, around 10 or 11, Leo will be quite well placed. And the best objects in Leo are, of course, the so-called Leo triplet, containing M65 and M66. And there's also another triplet of galaxies as well, M95 and M96, and an NGC galaxy. So there's actually two triplets that are readily observable in Leo, amongst many other galaxies, and we'll talk about those in the coming months. As we turn eastward, we can see that as we're now getting into autumn, of course, galaxy season's on the horizon. So we've already talked about Leo, which will be quite well placed later in the evening. And we also can see at this time of night Virgo just making an appearance above the horizon. And there's the centre of the wonderful Coma Virgo cluster, including M86 and M87, those two really large elliptical galaxies. So we'll be talking about that region of the sky, of course, in the coming months, in the Sky This Month show. Looking further up, the longest constellation of Hydra is just now fully above the horizon, so it just sort of extends the tails near the horizon all the way up quite high in the sky. There's M83, a face-on spiral, which we'll talk about later in a later show. But well placed at the moment in Hydra is NGC 3242, the so-called Ghost of Jupiter Nebula. And I actually had a good look at this just a week ago through my telescope, and it was a night of great seeing, and it really gave a fantastic view. You could pretty much see what you see in this photographic image here. So unlike, say, 1535 in Hydra, sorry, not in Hydra, in Eridanus, the Ghost of Jupiter generally shows an intense aqua green sort of colour. And you can see this round halo here. And on a night of excellent seeing, like it was when I looked at it last, inside the structure surrounding a very bright central star, you can see a very sharply defined eye structure. And while we're in this part of the sky, speaking of planetary nebulas, it's a good time of the year actually to see some of the best planetary nebulas in the sky. Of course, we have in Vela NGC 3132, also called the 8-burst nebula. And again, the other night, that also gave a wonderful view through my telescope. And again, use plenty of magnification, and particularly if you're under a suburban sky, you'll find an oxygen-free filter very useful for this object. Finally, looking towards the south, and it's one of my favourite times of the year looking southward, because longer-term viewers of the show would know that one of probably my favourite region of the sky is the so-called Argo Navis constellations. So that's the great ship Argo Navis. So you have Vela, the sails, Puppis, the poop deck, Pyxis, the compass, and you have the Kill, which is Carina, and that will actually be the constellation of the month for March. And we'll talk about some of the fine objects in Carina shortly. So some great objects in this region of the sky. So we've already talked about the 8-burst nebula, and in previous shows, I think last year, I talked about some objects in Puppis. I think even maybe in the December or November show. And this month we're going to take a closer look at Carina. And while you're in this part of the sky as well, of course, the Magellanic Clouds are fairly high up as well. So there's the large Magellanic Cloud there. There's the smaller Magellanic Cloud a little bit lower. And some other fine southern object constellations as well, including, of course, Dorado with all its wonderful galaxies. So looking at the calendar now for March 2025, and we can see, of course, as we're entering autumn, the nights are getting longer, and we can begin to start our series observing quite a bit earlier in the evening. So on the 1st of March, darkness began at 21:20 and went through to 5:35 in the morning. By the end of March, darkness will begin considerably earlier at 20:38 and will go through to 6:02 in the morning. So the moon phases for March are first quarter will be on the 7th, full moon will be on the 14th, last quarter will be on the 22nd, and new moon will be on the 29th. And the dark sky period where the moon won't interfere with our deep sky observations will begin on around the 22nd of March and go through to around the 2nd of April. So looking at the solar system now, beginning with the inner planets, we can see on the 1st of March, Mercury is really too close to the evening twilight to observe effectively, and the same goes for Venus as well. And as March progresses, both planets, Mercury and Venus, move in to conjunction with the Sun and are therefore obviously unobservable. And they will re-emerge as morning objects late March and into April. So, in fact, April, about mid-April, will be an excellent opportunity to observe not only Venus, but particularly Mercury. So we'll talk more about that in the April show. But for now, the inner planets really not well placed at all during March. So just winding back a little bit, we'll now take a look at the outer planets. So we can see, of course, Saturn is in conjunction behind the Sun. Neptune is also lost in the evening twilight. So the only planets we can really observe, that, as we've seen, are the three outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Uranus. So Uranus is also setting quite early in the evening, as we'll see. Jupiter's still reasonably well placed, and that will set around 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. And of course, we have Mars, which was in opposition in January. Still good. You might still see a few surface features. I did a week ago still, even though we're a couple of months out from opposition. But the night had excellent seeing. So probably this month would certainly be a last chance to have any hope of seeing some surface detail on Mars as well, because as the month progresses, of course, the distance between us just increases very rapidly now. So looking here, this shows you that northerly view that we saw on the Sky Tour. This time we're looking at around 8:30 on the 20th of March. So as we saw, Uranus is quite low down this time of year. So it sets at 10 o'clock, still at magnitude 5.8. So you may be able to pick it up in binoculars once twilight has ended, if you're at a dark sky. Otherwise, certainly in a telescope. Currently located sort of halfway between the Pleiades and the head of Cetus. Jupiter, very prominent in Taurus at the moment. Transits at 9 p.m. in the evening and then sets at around 11:30. So still reasonably well placed. This month would be your last chance to take a look at Jupiter and some of the moon events, perhaps. And it still has a very respectable diameter of 38 arc seconds. Mars, over here in Gemini, it's still quite visible, of course, at magnitude 0.1. Its size has now shrunk to 9.5 arc seconds. And it transits at around 9 p.m. in the evening. So, again, wasn't a favourable opposition, and now it's getting even smaller. So this month would be your last chance, I think, to have a hope at seeing any surface features on it. I did, like I said, the other night, about a week ago, on a night of excellent seeing, and I did manage to catch a few of the darker features on the surface of the planet. So as usual, I've attached a list of Jupiter moon events, which will cover in the description of this video, and that will cover events from March and April. So because we've only got a couple of hours now in the early evening where Jupiter is well placed, the number of events are fairly small. And of course, many of them are quite close to the horizon. So I'll let you take a look at this list at your leisure to see whether there's any events that you would like to take a look at. You can see a lot of them are very low. Anything below really 15 degrees or so is probably not worth viewing. But there are a few reasonable ones. So for example, here on the 9th of March at 9 p.m. in the evening, Io begins a shadow transit where Jupiter's around 25 degrees above the horizon. So that's still reasonable and might be worth a look at. Also, here's an eclipse. So Io will re-emerge or reappear from its eclipse with Jupiter, and that will occur around 8:30 on the 10th, and that has a respectable altitude of 28. So that would be the main thing to look at when considering these events is the altitude. So this is the altitude at the midpoint of the listed event. And as usual, I'll give two lists. One will be in Australian daylight savings time, and the other list will be in universal time for our friends that are viewing from other time zones. So for this month, we're going to concentrate on the constellation of Carina, which is the keel of the Argo-Navis ship. And our first object is going to be the Eta Carini Nebula, which is an object that most of you would be familiar with. It's probably the biggest and brightest, one of the biggest and brightest nebula in the sky, second only perhaps to the Orion Nebula. Very easy to find, even with the naked eye, unless you've got really light polluted skies. If you take a look at the Southern Cross and move your eye along the Milky Way towards the zenith, and you'll see sort of a glowing patch of light with your naked eye, and that'll be the region that we're after. And as soon as you swing binoculars in that region, even under a suburban sky, with averted vision, you should see some of the nebulosity associated with Eta Carini. So this picture here, this black and white picture, shows you a very good representation of most of the features that you'll see through a telescope with this nebula. What you'll find is that it has a considerably lower surface brightness than the Orion Nebula, for example. But under a very dark sky, you'll see most of the features that you can see in this photograph, and it also responds extremely strongly to an oxygen-free filter. So particularly if you're looking under a city sky, you'll find an oxygen-free filter to be invaluable for observing this nebula. So when you take a look at it through the telescope, the first thing you'll notice is this sort of triangular shape formed by the dark lanes that cut through it. So there's a lane there, there's a lane up here to the top right, and also a lane there heading downwards. And near the center of the nebula will be a reddish sort of star, and that is actually the star Eta Carini, which is responsible for the radiation from that star is responsible for illuminating most of this nebula. So the nebula itself, even though this is the main bright part, will extend quite a bit further away into the outer periphery, particularly if you're using a filter. And also you'll note in this photo, you can see here these sort of little dark streaks which cut through it. They remind me much of those dark streaks that you can also see in nebula such as the Eagle Nebula in Serpens, and also in the Rosette Nebula in Monoceros. So on a really dark, transparent night, take a look for all of these really sharp dark streaks that you'll see throughout the nebula. So once you've had a good look at the nebula itself, it's time to then take a look at the star Eta Carini. It's a really unique object, one of the most fascinating objects in the sky, I feel, because when you take a close look at Eta Carini, you can't actually see the star itself because it's surrounded by an hourglass-looking nebula called the Homunculus Nebula. So this star is very unstable, and it's been quite variable in brightness over the years. Currently, it's around 4.3. It has faded to as dim as around magnitude 7.9 or 8. And at its brightest, it's been observed at -1. And in particular, in 1843, there was a so-called great eruption where it brightened, and it underwent a huge explosion, which created the Homunculus Nebula that we can see today. So what actually happened during this explosion is the star ejected between what is estimated to be 15 and 45 solar masses of gas from its surface to form this Homunculus Nebula, which of course now has expanded to a size much greater than our solar system. which is why we can see it. So in a way, when you're looking at the Homunculus Nebula, you're sort of seeing, I guess, a star that's almost, or remnants of a star explosion that almost blew that star apart. So it's a really fascinating object, I think, and quite unique in the sky. So because of its intense brightness, it'll stand. You don't need to use a nebula filter. It's better without a filter, and you can use really high magnification, as much as the conditions will withstand. On a really good night of good seeing, just like in this Hubble photo here, what you'll see is the two orangey lobes, and if the seeing is really good, you'll also see this mottling. You'll see these dark streaks in the lobes, which is this mottling that you can see here in the photograph. And also through my 12 and 18-inch scopes, I have occasionally also observed a sharp sort of spike coming out the middle of the Homunculus Nebula around the waist of the hourglass, and that's this jet of material that you can see here in the photograph. So do take a look at this object. And the other good thing about it, because it has such a high surface brightness, and you can use high magnification, it also looks great from the backyard as well. So zooming out now from the Eta Carini nebula region, this is a great part of the sky to scan with your binoculars. So this shows you sort of a simulated view through 10 by 42 binoculars. And I just want to talk about three lovely star clusters that kind of surround in a triangle sort of shape the nebula itself. So if we look down to the left, you'll see sort of a peppery, through binoculars at least, you'll see sort of a fairly concentrated peppery sort of group of stars, and that's the star cluster 3532. So that's a fantastic cluster, sometimes called the pincushion cluster. And if you're ever showing someone through your telescope and you ask them, do they want to see an eyepiece full of stars, this is the field of view to show them. So here's a simulated view through a 12-inch telescope. It even looks better through the eyepiece itself. Relatively large in diameter at around 50 arc seconds. So you need to use a reasonably low magnification to fit all of the stars in. And the fantastic part about this field is the background stars themselves are quite dense as well. So not only do you have an extremely dense open cluster, but the background stars are quite prominent as well. So there's literally hundreds of stars that you can see, and particularly it looks great through a city sky, but under a dark sky, there's hundreds and hundreds of stars that you can see in the eyepiece view. Absolutely fantastic. Now looking back at the nebula, and if we now go to the bottom right, there's a so-called Southern Pleiades. So this is actually, the designation is IC 2602. Quite a contrast to the pincushion cluster that we just looked at. This has much fewer stars, but they're really bright and they really stand out from the foreground stars and from the foreground. And they've got a lovely deep bluish color, which I guess is where the Southern Pleiades sort of nickname comes from. And this is a much larger cluster as well. So this is around 100 arc minutes in diameter. So that's about 1.4, almost 1.5 degrees in diameter. So you'll need a really low field eyepiece to get all of these stars in. And finally, one of my favorite open clusters is found above on the top of that triangle, and you can also see that through binoculars. You'll see it as you scan above the Eta Carini Nebula, you'll see a tiny little grouping of stars, and that's the gem cluster, also known as NGC 3293. And this reminds me very much of the jewel box, Herschel's jewel box, which I think most of you would be familiar with on the Southern Cross. And this, again, is a lovely star cluster. It looks nice through binoculars, but really needs a telescope perhaps to see it in all of its glory. And a bit like the jewel box, not only does it show some beautiful compact grouping of stars, but it has some nice coloured stars in it as well. There's some beautiful red stars amongst that cluster as well. So that's another one that I hope you get an opportunity to enjoy. Thanks everyone for joining me in today's show. I hope you enjoyed it and find the information useful. Looks like we're off to a fairly good start to the year with plenty of clear skies. Hopefully that will continue throughout autumn, so you can enjoy one of these wonderful objects on show. So until the next show in April, bye for now.